Why are we here?
So it's very interesting how currently no one is thinking about all of this conversation about identity, right? So we have uh, because of the way people are writing software right now, we have web, we have mobile, and we have machine learning. Guys just making noise everywhere. No one is thinking about all these fundamental things about what's identity in general with regards to people getting online. And so we have 1,000,001 people joining online. I mean, like if right now you're in Africa, you're probably aware of the thing of the next billion creators. But then as they're coming online, there are all of these profiles that they're going to come into. And also you've seen, like with COVID, everyone is now writing code at home. And so if you're in a house where you are 4 people who are developers and probably you decide to use one desktop PC, what's it to prevent someone from coming and editing your code and probably just pushing it to the organization or moving some files from the organization? Then everyone is wondering, like, hey, what happened here? And so I think today we're here to just talk about the whole aspect of identity, just looking at it from a more end-to-end. Maybe we might get deeper, maybe we might not get deeper. And so I am joined by Somet. Let me not say what he does. He'll probably say what he does with his life. The interesting part is an interesting part also. Yeah. So, Somet, what do you do? Just tell us, just give us an intro about it.
I am a jack of all trades, and I'm kidding. No. So I spend a majority of my time working with startups. I happen to work for a small company you might have heard of called Microsoft. And
Very small.
they're very,
Yeah.
very, very small. Yeah,
Yes.
we're a startup. We can,
Yes.
you know, the way people just throw around the name startup. Anyway. No, so under Microsoft, I spend my time working trying to help startups understand how do you take that amazing solution that you built, an amazing app, and how do you sell it to enterprise? And by that, now leveraging on the capabilities of what Microsoft has done. On my spare time, I do pet projects. I have a background as a developer. Although I haven't written code, but I do pride myself as a low code or no code developer. So I always try and find the fastest, easiest way to build stuff without writing code. But
Yeah,
we can get into it.
This is probably something that I've noticed with most Microsoft guys after was it Gates or Balmer who said he loves lazy developers.
Yeah. I am one of them. And
You're
those
one of them.
guys, yeah,
So you're
one
like
of the things is
Microsoft.
we can do a video later on, what are the tools out there to enable those guys in tech who
Yeah.
love tech, but not necessarily passionate about writing code. I'm one of them. So I've figured out ways of building cool stuff without writing code.
Okay. Definitely we'll get into that sometime in the future. So now with all this identity, when you hear the word identity being thrown around, especially in the tech scene right now, what comes into mind for you? And it's good you've talked about the way you help so many startups and developers. You help them build cool things, you help them scale their solution. So what comes to mind when you hear someone talking about identity?
Yeah, I'll take it in sort of two angles. One, the angle of a business who's probably using this cool stuff that you're building, and the developer's side. So if you think about it from the company side, every company, the first thing they usually buy, it's instead of find new project, it's usually go online, buy a domain. We figure out the name, we buy a domain, and then, so a domain is usually the identity of a company. Now, within that company, you have employees. So how do you give these employees a sense of identity that I belong to this organization? So when I communicate to you, Frank, I'm communicating with a company identity, and usually that is an email address. When I think of identity, I think as, what is that unique identifier of you as a person interacting with technology? So I'll give an example. Today, you want to sign into an email, you use your email address. That is your identity as a personal. That's how Google identifies you in their email system, your email address. In the context of a company, we tend to use quite more beyond email. We log into websites, internal tools, apps, door access, what access. The tricky part is we live in a world of multi-sensors, multi-technology, multiple tools. But the biggest challenge is, how do you create a way of a unique identity system? The same way governments create the ID card to say that this is what we're going to identify people in our country across, irrespective of which government agency or which company you go to, your unique identifier in government is your ID. So part of that in tech is thinking, how do you create that unique identifier across now? They're interesting in many ways to do it. I know a lot of people, any email address that you can sign up, boom, done. But they're really cool technologies. And especially now in the times of COVID, one of the things that a lot of companies will start experiencing is you have all these people coming online, starting to use interesting tools. But how do you make sure as a company that the person who's using this tool, the person who's transacting is who they say they are? I always say never underestimate human ingenuity and human stupidity. I could find interesting ways of getting through into your app service or whatever without necessarily creating an identity. And then if you look at it even from the developer side, we always file new project and the first thing we work on is login. But I'm thinking, you know what? Why do I have to create, every time I create an app, I create a whole set of new identities? So at some point for the company, they're like, when I see Somet at gmail.com, Somet at outlook.com, is this actually Somet or is it some guy who has his username and password? Because as human beings, we will share usernames and passwords, and there are very many examples of people who do that. But yeah, that's what comes to me when I think about identity.
Okay, cool. So let me ask this question now. When you're also thinking about identity and in terms of, most people are thinking about just like logging in. Are there other things, let's say, in the whole spectrum of identity that someone needs to think about, or is it just the access only? Is it me worrying about who is trying to get in, or are there, why should I as a person say, okay, cool, I'm not only interested in the people logging in because I've already covered that one. Are there those other extra things that you think, hey, you know what, over and above this is something that's really, really important for this part? Yeah.
Quite a number of things actually. So if you look at the challenges of coming online today, a lot of it is cyber attacks. So thinking about security, threat protection, protecting information, especially if you look at it from a company's perspective. If I'm an IT manager in an organization, I want to be able to know who's using my service when, where, and what on what device. And I know that sounds very paranoid, but if you think of it from a security perspective, usually the first, and they say the plane of cyber attacks has changed. No one is hacking a machine. People are hacking human beings. So if I can tell Frank has the highest privilege in this organization and I can completely digitally impersonate you, then that means it's very easy for me to come into a company and fraud quite a number of things. In fact, a lot of attacks out there today are based on that. Give an example, phishing attacks is based on the fact that I can spoof my identity. Think of social hacking. If I can completely impersonate you in a bank, I can get the bank to transact stuff that you are not aware of. So it not only is not a thing of, oh, I just need to be able to get into this tool or this service. It's about, think about security, think about information protection. A good example is, imagine you're a HR person in an organization and you have this really interesting Excel sheet of everyone's pay. Well, we shouldn't be having an Excel sheet in the first place, but let's say you do.
But like most companies, you'd find someone with an Excel and sit down. So they have like Tamre, Somet, and so it's like, oh yeah, this is in fact, this is the name, this is the job this is the position that they hold within the company, and then after that, from the position they hold, this is the email address again, and then this is the phone number, and then this is the pay that they receive every month, and all other details are put by, let's say this one HR person has it on an Excel document. Yeah, so like let's look at that example.
Yeah, so think about it in quite a number of perspectives. One, the amount of personal information you have on that Excel sheet is detrimental if it gets into the wrong hands. Number two, you don't want it to get into the wrong hands. Number three, who has access to it? You want to be able to make sure that maybe it's only authorized finance or HR people who should have access to that information. So you're thinking of everything around privacy, to information protection, to data protection. So it cuts across, and even security. So it cuts across a lot of things. And, you know, at an early stage, you never think about how identity is a thing until it becomes an issue. Now, for developers, if I could flip the conversation, think of it this way. How can I accelerate how fast people get my application if I don't have to worry about identity? Because if you do use a very good identity system, then that means there's someone handling users, devices, and how data is accessed in your app. So there are certain things you don't have to worry about. But number two is if you're building, especially, and I'll put a bias for enterprise, if you're selling to a large company, you want to make sure that whoever is using this solution, if it's to be used internally in a company, that they are who they are. They provide some form of identity. So, and I think it accelerates how fast you can get companies to adopt your solution without now going back to have conversations around, you tested your security modules, you know, what have you done to protect this application? And then you're having to have, oh, can it sit within our firewall? Can it sit within our server? So to some extent, not 100%, but to some extent, you've covered a lot of your security landscape. So you have less to worry about, especially if you get a very good provider. And there's quite a number of them out there.
And so he's usually the argument, and I think I've encountered this where I think I wrote code, then I did all this software architecting bit, and then now it's like now I'm balancing in between writing code and doing all that software architect. And one thing I noticed is sometimes you meet people who come and tell you, hey, I don't want to use login with X company. Now, and this you're talking about all this old stuff, and someone says, I don't want to use login with this company because why am I giving them data? And because I mean, you can bear me witness right now, everyone is paranoid about the data that they're sharing out there. They want to have all the data. I mean, you're talking about startups because they've seen all this thing where someone comes and says, hey, we have data of like 5 million people. And so why should someone say, I'm sort of giving this responsibility or part of this responsibility to, let's say, Microsoft or Facebook, and say, look, I trust that these people are going to do this thing instead of me trying to come up with a whole.
So you have to, you kind of have to think of it in two ways. One, there are what are called personal identities, and those are for very consumer-focused applications. And then there are what are called corporate identities. These are more for business solutions. So again, at the end of the day, it depends on who your target market is and what they do. If you're targeting and you're building a consumer application, you have a plethora of choice. You could build your own, which is fine and easy if you want to fully control what that kind of information and do as you please with it. You can leverage on the likes of Google sign-in or Facebook or Microsoft. They do reduce the barrier of entry, especially for your end consumer, because then I don't have to think about, okay, I have to create this new identity. They want to use their existing identity, and that's the whole idea of identities. I, as a consumer, shouldn't have to have 50, 60, 70 different identities for all the different tools and services that I use. I should be able to have two sets of identities, one personal, one corporate, and use that to sign in across. And there are tools that allow you to do that. So again, at the end of the day, it depends on who your target market is. I'll give you this for free. Most enterprises traditionally have used the Active Directory that used to be on Windows Server if they were running a Windows server. If they're running anything else, they'll probably use some other tool. So if you're thinking about enterprise, I'd say go for Active Directory. There's a cloud version, Azure Active Directory. You can consider G Suite's identity system, and because a lot of companies, startups use G Suite's identity system. But what's interesting is the fact that even if you look at how both companies have now approached identity, is democratizing it down to the user, in the sense of Google has realized, hey, it seems a lot of big businesses that we sell G Suite to already use AD. So instead of telling them replicate all your identities to G Suite, just authenticate against Azure AD and then send that token to whatever service you're using. Or some companies have chosen to adopt OAuth and then now get everything to authenticate against that. So I guess for developers, think of it this way. What's the easiest way for your customer to get on board? Is inclusive across multiple areas that you'd want to authenticate.
And so my question becomes, is there a risk of a startup trusting a third party to handle all that for them, or do you think it? I know, like they're the benefits, but then there's also where someone comes and tells me, "Oh, I don't want this people. I don't want to give them this information. I want to have this information myself." Because maybe they're thinking, "I want to go and sell this to this other company." And I think I've seen a couple of instances like that where someone says, "It's okay. I want to use a specific financial service." And you find that there's a company that can handle the old part for them, and then they're like, "No, you know what? No, I want to handle everything on my own."
So let's use an example. Bank X in Kenya wants to buy this solution from you, and you've built your own identity system. Then you start having questions of how secure is that data, and why should the bank use your identity system versus what they already have? So one, you kind of have to look at who's your target customer, what do they use? If they don't have anything, create your own. So again, it depends on your target market. If it's consumer, yes, you can get them to create your own sets of identities, and that way you have 100% control. But then you now bear the responsibility. And I think this is where developers forget this. You then now bear the responsibility of making sure that you're able to protect that information just in case. Just in case. Because you never know. I mean, the world is full of all manner of people, human ingenuity. So by you deciding, you know what, I'm going to build my own identity because I don't trust anyone, then you have to bear the responsibility and create trust for your customers that you are securing the information. Otherwise, then if somebody loses trust in your solution, they won't use it. And I know that sounds a bit over their head, and devs are thinking, but why would my consumer think about trust? I'm like, the day and age of which we operate in, trust will soon become a big thing.
Okay, so you work at Microsoft. I'm imagining there are services that can help people manage identity. I mean, you talked about the Azure Active Directory part. All this, also about like all this Microsoft identity solutions that exist out there, and like how you can play around with them to just like achieve all of this thing.
So the Azure Active Directory is one of my favorite tools on the Microsoft Cloud. It's the one thing that sort of brings all together all the different platforms. So if you think about your personal Hotmail or Outlook account, it sits on some sort of an Active Directory. If you think about all these corporate accounts, they all sit on an Active Directory, and they do quite some interesting things. It allows you to delegate management of not only usernames and passwords, but there's quite a lot you can store. It's for an organization. You can think about, where do people sit in terms of offices? What's their phone number? What devices do they use? And then what policies or what groups do they belong to? So there's quite a number of things that AD has today that allows developers to abstract. So I'll give you a good example. If I am building a leave management tool, that I want automatically to, every time I put in a request, the approval goes to my manager. Now,
Yeah.
if I was building everything from scratch, I'd then have to build the identity system, then the approval system, and then the security system. On AD, you then can delegate that entire work that on Active Directory. You can really push the boundary of what you tie Active Directory to. I think today there is probably 19.3 million organizations that use Active Directory. You can authenticate your Wi-Fi against Active Directory. You can authenticate your door access against Active Directory. So that for your end user, they have one set of credentials. I have one username, one password, multi-factor authentication handle for me. And that way I can sign into billions and billions of applications at once without having to create an account for every other new tool that I use. So even if you think about the classic example of um, how do you manage licenses? So I know back in the day, people used to distribute licenses with product keys, and you put this license for this dev tool on a dev's machine, and once they leave their company, forget that license, it's gone. But what you start seeing is companies are now tying licenses to people. As I speak right now, I have like 4 devices on top of me. Imagine if I was paying a license for every device, but I can tie the license to my identity and allow me to use that one license across multiple sign-ins. And it's the same thing to, how we build applications. If I have one set of identities, then that means I can sign in across multiple platforms. So you're kind of making the experience for your end consumer quite easy. So that's Microsoft has Active Directory. It ties in a lot of different tools that you can use, but you can also authenticate it against your third parties. So there's quite some nifty stuff you can do with it.
So are there any other, let's say, I know Microsoft has an identity platform, a whole bunch of pages dedicated specifically for identity, and I guess because we're talking about Active Directory, we don't fail to mention Azure. It has all these things that exist within the whole identity platform, and I mean, like, you speaking from someone who works at Microsoft. Probably you could maybe delve further into it. And I know maybe for this session, we might not get to that point of doing code, or we might. Yeah, exactly. And sad, because I know it's like we can get really deep into talking about identity. Because I know, like, there's something that's very interesting in that when I started interacting with Azure, it was interesting how I had to know or have an understanding of things to do with permissions. Or doesn't come off the top of my head right now, but like understanding all these permissions, understanding that if I move my, like even data management stuff, like what goes into me thinking, what are the policies within my organization or different organizations with regards to accessing different levels of information, sending information, receiving information, and things like that. And so I am wondering whether, if I am a developer right now and I want to start off with, maybe I want to be very cautious with the word. I want to be very active in thinking about how am I thinking about my identity in general with regards to all these applications that I'm building. Where do I start from? And that is, I'm just going to bias this towards the Microsoft side. How would you, for instance, advise me, someone who is a startup guy or a developer? Like, what are the steps that I can follow to just like get started on that?
Yeah. I guess if you think about it, you kind of have to understand beforehand what role identity plays in the solution that you're building. That initially, a lot of people never think about, but becomes important is so think about if you're building an application that has a lot of sensitive information and you want to really, really make sure, and especially in this world of everybody coming online, when we used to be back in the days of filing cabinets and physical servers, your security parameter was where that server sat. It was your data center. It was where you are. But now that data lives in the cloud and literally has no boundary, you kind of have to figure out, so as this data sits irrespective of where it is, or this device, how do you protect it? So you can think of it from a security perspective. So one of the things in the world of identity they talk about is zero trust. The approach of, how do I create a model where I am granting access and not everyone has access until somebody misbehaves and then we revoke access. You should think about it the other way around. You think about how do I lock the system and then grant access when it's needed. But grant access in a sense of, if I am creating permissions for, give an example, the finance team, how do I make sure that the day this application gets to 1,000, a million people, I'm not having to go to figure out who individually has this permission for this finance tool, but I create what are called security groups. So you assign permissions to a group and add people onto the group. So that could be a way you think about it. Think about, let's say identity protects a number of things. It's people, devices, and data. So people in the sense of, how are they signing in? Who are they, who they say they are, and how people enforce that. And because human beings will tend to share credentials, you enforce that using technologies like multi-factor authentication. So you've seen people use options like authenticators, physical tokens. Banks are very good good examples of people who use physical tokens for authentication. People use physical cards or proximity devices. I know Microsoft does it with biometrics. Hello. And that means also at the end of the day, your identity system is collecting personal information. So you kind of have to think about how you secure that. There's always that one person in every company who will click on anything. And usually that's a point of any attack. How do you make sure that if my phone is lost, somebody doesn't use my credentials to get in? We human beings have this bad habit of writing passwords on a sticky note on your desktop or in a notepad document on your desktop that is labeled passwords. And so how do I, in an organization, make sure that people's devices are compliant and not necessarily block people from using the devices they want? Because trust me, that CEO in that startup wants to use his iPad to access company information irrespective of where he goes. So how do you enable that scenario without forcing him to use a very bulky workstation laptop that belongs to the company? For smaller startups, you find a lot of your employees will come with their own devices. How do you enable them to work without blocking them completely? How do you make sure that their devices are compliant? So those are some of the things Active Directory helps you figure out that most people don't think about. And then now you look at data. Data now moves around to all manner of places. If I have this Excel sheet with my payroll, how do I make sure it is wherever it sits, it is accessed by the right person? So one of the cool things Active Directory allows you to do is to protect documents and PDFs and all that stuff, so that irrespective of where this document sits, because people use different systems. I'll give an example. I could use Dynamics or Office 365 in my company. You could use Google Suite. Someone else could use SAP. But irrespective of where this document sits, is it being accessed by the right people? So if you want to really go down to figuring out, how do I protect documents? But you can really, again, push the boundary with developers around how do you protect the information within your apps from being stolen? One of the things I think in our social world we've seen people use against people is screenshots. If you follow a lot of Instagram and social media, there's a lot of screenshots moving around. And people use all manner of apps for the wrong reasons. So you find people using personal apps for work. How do you allow people that flexibility, but in the sense you're able to protect your information? So I know AD allows you to extend the capability of protecting things like screenshotting on your custom built business apps, or even actually copying information from that app into another third party. So you can really push the boundary of what identity can do for your data. And then the last piece is endpoints. And I think for the longest time, that has been the biggest plane for attacks. is targeting endpoints, open ports on networks, or access points, or once I'm in your network, then I get access to everything. So thinking around, how do you protect endpoints? There's this cool thing on Active Directory called service accounts. If you want an application authenticating against another application, do you have to create a user account and then you store the credentials somewhere on a connection string, or can you use what's called a service principal? So there are those things that, they look very IT centric from like an IT manager's problem, but it boils down back to the developers. These are things that you need to think about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So because of time, are there any, I like the way sometimes I sit in like all these panels or you watch stuff and someone asks, do you have any last words? And this is where you sort of like start to wear this very nice, cool wizardry hat looking very old with white beards, and you're like,
and then look for the coolest phrase you can say.
Coolest phrase, because people are going to quote that one. That's what most bloggers are going to use and like quote you and say, hey, this is what he said. No one is interested in the first maybe 20, 30 minutes of your talk. They're just interested in this last 5 minutes. What did he say? When they type it down. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For me, I'd say for developers, identity is not the thing that your IT manager should worry about. It's something that you should think about, but also think of it as a way of enabling you to accelerate how fast you build certain apps or how fast your apps get adopted by users. So just open your mind to the possibilities of what identity can do to you for you.
And so for you, what you're saying is developers need to think of identity not like a by the way thing, but they need to architect their apps with identity at the core of everything they're doing, right?
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in for this time. Sorry we bored you if we did bore you, but this.
And sorry we did not write code. I'm a no-code developer.